We all know the sting of being overlooked, judged by what others see on the surface. Martha Caldwell carries that weight every day in the mountain town of Timber Ridge. At nearly 300 pounds, folks see her size, never her kind heart. She works hard at the general store, but when her legs ache from heavy lifting, she sits alone with her pain. Then one day, Silas McGraw shows up. This mountain man everyone fears kneels down and rubs her tired legs. Nobody expected what happened next. His simple kindness starts something beautiful that shocks the whole town. Can one act of compassion transform two lonely souls into something the wilderness has never seen? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The morning sun cast long shadows across Timber Ridge as Martha Caldwell laced up her worn leather boots for another day at Henley's general store. These boots had carried her through 5 years of service, their cracked leather and thin soles telling the story of countless hours on her feet, hauling flour, sacks, and stacking shelves. Each step on the wooden floorboards sent a familiar ache through her legs, a reminder of the physical toll her work demanded from her substantial frame. At 28, Martha had accepted her place in the town's unspoken hierarchy. She was the helpful shopkeeper who could lift heavy items and work long hours, but never the woman who turned heads or received second glances from eligible men. The mirror in her small boarding house room reflected back a face that was kind but plain. Framed by brown hair she kept in a simple bun. Her dresses, sewn by her own capable hands, were practical and modest, designed to accommodate her size rather than flatter it. The walk to work took her down Main Street, where she nodded politely to the early risers. Mrs. Henderson, the banker's wife, offered a tight smile before whispering something to her companion. Martha had learned to read the language of those whispers, the quick glances, the hushed tones, the way conversations paused when she passed. In a town of 800 souls, everyone knew everyone, and Martha's story was written in their collective memory. She had arrived in Timber Ridge 5 years ago with nothing but a small inheritance from her late aunt and a letter of introduction to Mr. Henley. Her parents had died of fever when she was 16, leaving her to fend for herself in a world that measured a woman's worth by her marriage prospects. At 23, already considered past her prime and burdened by her size, Martha had chosen the practical path of steady employment over the impossible dream of romance. The general store stood at the corner of Main and Cedar, its weathered sign creaking in the mountain breeze. Martha pulled out her key, grateful for these quiet moments before the day's customers arrived. Inside, the familiar scents of coffee beans, leather goods, and lamp oil greeted her. Shelves lined the walls from floor to ceiling, packed with everything from farm tools to ladies' bonnets. This was her domain, organized by her careful hands and maintained by her tireless efforts. She began her morning routine, sweeping the floors and dusting the merchandise. The physical work felt good, despite the ache in her joints. Martha took pride in her strength, in her ability to move heavy crates and stock high shelves without assistance. Mr. Henley often remarked that she did the work of two people, though his praise always came with the underlying suggestion that her value lay purely in her utility. As the sun climbed higher, the first customers began to arrive. Mrs. Patterson needed fabric for her daughter's wedding dress, and Martha helped her select the finest white cotton the store carried. The older woman's excitement was infectious as she spoke of the upcoming ceremony, describing the eligible young men who would attend and the hope that her other daughters might catch someone's eye. "A woman needs a good husband to be complete," Mrs. Patterson said, measuring the fabric against Martha's outstretched arms. "I do hope my girls won't wait too long to settle down. A woman alone in this world has such a difficult path." Martha smiled and nodded, though the words stung with their implied judgment. She wrapped the fabric carefully, her fingers working with practiced efficiency. These conversations had become routine, married women offering unsolicited advice about the importance of finding a husband, while their eyes conveyed pity for Martha's apparent failure to do so. The morning progressed with its typical rhythm of customers and commerce. Martha handled each transaction with professional courtesy, her natural warmth shining through despite the social barriers that kept her at arm's length from most townspeople. She recommended products, helped with measurements, and listened to gossip about who was courting whom and which families were prospering. It was during the afternoon lull that Martha first heard the stories about Silas McGraw. Two ranchers taking shelter from a sudden mountain shower spoke in hushed tones about the mysterious mountain man who lived somewhere high in the peaks above town. "Seen him again yesterday?" said Tom Bradley, shaking rainwater from his hat. "Big as a grizzly bear and twice as scary. They say he fought in the war back east before coming out here. My brother claims he once saw McGraw kill a mountain lion with his bare hands," added Pete Morrison. "Lives up there all alone, hunting and trapping, comes down maybe twice a year for supplies, never says more than what he needs to buy." Martha listened while organizing bolts of fabric, intrigued despite herself. She had glimpsed the man they described once or twice, a tall, broad-shouldered figure with dark hair and a thick beard, moving through town with purposeful strides. He seemed to command a respectful distance from everyone, not from fear exactly, but from an understanding that he existed outside their normal social boundaries. "Why do you suppose he keeps to himself like that?" Martha asked, surprising herself by joining the conversation. Both men looked at her with mild surprise, as if forgetting she was there. Tom shrugged. "A man like that probably has his reasons. Or does things to people, changes them. Maybe the mountains are the only place he can find peace." The rain stopped as suddenly as it had started, and the ranchers departed, leaving Martha with new thoughts to occupy her mind. She found herself wondering about this Silas McGraw, imagining what kind of life a person would choose such solitude. There was something appealing about the idea of existing beyond society's judgments and expectations, free from the constant weight of other people's opinions. As evening approached, Martha's legs began to throb with familiar pain. The day had been busier than usual, with several large orders requiring heavy lifting. She had helped load a wagon with feed sacks, moved cases of canned goods, and rearranged the furniture display. Her body, while strong, carried the burden of her weight through every physical task. She was arranging the last of the day's deliveries when Mr. Henley emerged from his office, his round face wearing its perpetual expression of mild concern. At 55, he was a practical man who valued efficiency above all else, and Martha's reliability had made her indispensable to his operation. "Martha, that shipment from Denver arrived late. I'll need you to stay and get it sorted before tomorrow's." "Rush," he said, consulting his pocket watch. "Can't have customers waiting while we dig through crates." "Of course, Mr. Henley," Martha replied, though her legs protested at the thought of more lifting. She had learned long ago that complaining about physical discomfort was a luxury she couldn't afford. Her job was her lifeline, the thing that kept her fed and housed and purposeful. The Denver shipment contained everything from kitchen implements to leather goods, all packed in wooden crates that required careful unpacking and inventory. Martha worked methodically, checking each item against the shipping manifest and finding appropriate places on the shelves. The physical exertion felt good in some ways, proving her capability and worth, but her legs ached with increasing intensity as the evening wore on. By the time she finished, the sun had set behind the mountains, casting Timber Ridge in purple. Twilight. Martha locked the store and began her walk home, each step sending spikes of pain through her calves and thighs. She had pushed herself too hard today, but tomorrow would demand the same effort, and the day after that. This was her life, measured in inventory and transactions, and the slow accumulation of wages that barely covered her modest expenses. The boarding house where she rented a small room stood at the quiet end of Main Street. Mrs. Cooper, the elderly proprietor, maintained strict rules about noise and visitors, but she provided clean accommodations and decent meals for those who could afford them. Martha climbed the narrow stairs to her room, grateful for the privacy it offered. She sat heavily on her narrow bed, finally allowing herself to acknowledge the pain that had been building throughout the day. Her fingers worked at the laces of her worn leather boots, pulling them free with relief. These boots had served her faithfully, but they offered little cushioning for someone who spent long hours on her feet. She rubbed her aching calves, wishing there was someone who might care about her comfort, someone who might offer a gentle touch to ease the day's strain. The thought surprised her with its intensity. Martha had trained herself not to indulge in such fantasies, knowing they led only to disappointment. She was practical above all else, accepting of her circumstances and focused on making the best of the hand life had dealt her. But sometimes, in the quiet of her room, she allowed herself to imagine what it might feel like to be cherished, to have someone see past her size to the woman beneath. Outside her window, the mountains loomed dark against the star-filled sky. Somewhere up there, if the stories were true, lived a man who had chosen solitude over society's expectations. Martha wondered what it would be like to have such freedom, to exist without constantly measuring herself against other people's standards. Perhaps tomorrow would bring another glimpse of the mysterious mountain man, another moment to wonder about lives lived beyond the ordinary boundaries of Timber Ridge society. The next morning brought an unusually large delivery that would test Martha's endurance. 3 wagons from the railroad depot carried supplies for the approaching winter: barrels of molasses, sacks of grain, and crates of preserved goods that needed immediate storage. Mr. Henley surveyed the mountain of merchandise with satisfaction, already calculating the profits from autumn sales. "This'll keep us busy all day," he announced, rubbing his hands together. "Martha, I'll handle the customers while you manage the inventory. Need everything sorted and shelved by closing." Martha nodded, already mentally organizing the task ahead. She began with the heaviest items, rolling barrels into position and hoisting grain sacks onto her shoulders. Her body protested with each lift, but she maintained her steady rhythm. This was familiar work, the kind of physical labor that had defined her value in the community. By midday, sweat dampened her dress, despite the cool mountain air. Her legs trembled with fatigue, and sharp pains shot through her calves with every step. She had moved nearly 2 tons of merchandise, her strength flagging, but her determination unwavering. The familiar ache in her lower back reminded her that she was pushing beyond her limits. During the brief lunch break, Martha sat on the store's back steps, trying to ease the knots in her muscles. Her worn leather boots felt tight around her swollen feet, and she longed to remove them, but knew the afternoon's work still awaited. She massaged her calves through her thick stockings, grateful for a moment's respite. "Heavy load today," observed a deep voice from nearby. Martha looked up to see a tall figure standing at the corner of the building. Silas McGraw had appeared as silently as morning mist, his presence somehow both startling and comforting. Up close, she could see the weathered lines around his dark eyes, the careful way he held himself, like a man accustomed to watching and listening before acting. "Yes, sir," she replied, suddenly self-conscious about her disheveled appearance. "Winter supplies came in early this year." Silas stepped closer, his gaze taking in her obvious exhaustion. He wore simple clothes, wool pants, a cotton shirt, and a leather vest that had seen years of mountain weather. His dark hair was longer than fashion dictated, and his beard was neatly trimmed, despite his reputation for wildness. "You're working yourself mighty hard," he said, his voice carrying genuine concern rather than judgment. "Legs giving you trouble?" Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. The last thing she wanted was pity from this legendary figure, this man who commanded respect through strength and solitude. "I'm fine, thank you. Just need to finish the inventory." But as she stood to return to work, her right leg buckled slightly. The pain that had been building all day suddenly intensified, sending a sharp spike from her knee to her hip. She caught herself against the doorframe, embarrassed by her body's betrayal. Without hesitation, Silas moved forward, "Sit back down," he said, his tone gentle but firm. "You're hurting yourself." "I can't," Martha protested, though her leg throbbed with each word. "Mr. Henley needs—" "Mr. Henley can wait 5 minutes," Silas interrupted, guiding her back to the steps with surprising gentleness. "You can't help anyone if you collapse." Before Martha could object further, Silas knelt before her. The sight of this imposing man, known throughout the territory for his strength and independence, kneeling at her feet, left her speechless. His hands moved to her boots, working the laces with careful fingers. "What are you doing?" she whispered acutely, aware that anyone might see them. "Helping," he replied simply. "These boots are too tight for the work you're doing. Your feet are swollen." Martha wanted to protest, wanted to maintain her dignity and independence, but the relief as her boots came free was overwhelming. Silas's hands were warm and calloused from years of mountain work, yet they moved with surprising gentleness as he examined her swollen feet and ankles. "May I?" he asked, indicating her legs. Martha nodded, unable to speak. No man had ever touched her with such care, such absence of judgment or expectation. Silas's strong hands began working the knots from her calf muscles, his touch firm but tender. The pain that had been her constant companion began to ease under his skilled ministrations. "You carry too much," he said quietly, his fingers finding each point of tension. "Not just today, but every day. I've watched you working, seen how hard you push yourself. It's my job," Martha managed, though her voice shook with more than pain. "Your job is to help customers and keep inventory," Silas corrected, his hands never pausing in their gentle work. "Your job isn't to destroy your body, proving something to people who don't deserve your effort." The massage continued in comfortable silence, Silas's touch working magic on muscles that hadn't known relief in months. Martha felt tears prick her eyes, not from pain, but from the overwhelming kindness of this unexpected gift. When had anyone last cared about her comfort, her well-being? "Better?" Silas asked after several minutes, his hands stilling on her calves. Martha nodded, afraid to trust her voice. The pain had receded to a manageable level, and for the first time all day, she felt like she might actually finish the inventory without collapsing. "Thank you," she whispered. "I don't know why you—" "Because you needed help," Silas said, rising to his feet. "Sometimes that's reason enough." As he helped her put her boots back on, loosening the laces to accommodate her swollen feet, Martha became aware of voices from the street. A small crowd had gathered, drawn by the unusual sight of the mountain man kneeling before the general store clerk. She could see Mrs. Henderson and 2 other town matrons watching with barely concealed shock. "People are staring," Martha said, suddenly mortified by the attention. Silas glanced toward the gathering crowd, his expression unmoved. "Let them stare. They've got nothing better to do." He stood and offered Martha his hand to help her up. The simple gesture felt momentous, a bridge across the social divide that separated them. When she placed her hand in his, she felt the strength that had become legend, but also the gentleness that defied every story told about him. "You take care of yourself, Miss Caldwell," he said, and she realized he knew her name, had been aware of her existence in ways she never imagined. "Thank you, Mr. McGraw," she replied, watching as he nodded and walked away with that characteristic purposeful stride. The crowd dispersed slowly, their whispers following Martha as she returned to work. But something had changed in those few minutes on the store steps. The pain in her legs was manageable now, but more importantly, she carried with her the memory of genuine kindness, of being seen and cared for without condition or judgment. As she continued organizing inventory, Martha found herself thinking about Silas's words. She had been destroying her body, pushing beyond reasonable limits to prove her worth to a community that measured her value solely by her productivity. For the first time, she wondered if there might be another way to live, another way to see herself. The handwritten note appeared the next morning, tucked under a jar of preserves on the store counter. In careful script, It simply read, "Thank you for your kindness yesterday. Your strength is an inspiration. Sem." Martha held the paper with trembling hands, reading the words over and over. Someone saw her strength, not her size. Someone appreciated her character, not just her capacity for labor. The note represented something she had never dared hope for: recognition of her worth as a person, not just as a useful pair of hands. She folded the note carefully and tucked it into her apron pocket, where she could feel its presence throughout the day. Every time her legs began to ache, every time she caught whispers and stares from the townspeople, she remembered Silas's gentle hands and his simple declaration that helping was reason enough. Something beautiful was beginning, something that would challenge everything Timber Ridge believed about worth and love, and the courage it takes to see past the surface to the heart beneath. The note changed everything and nothing all at once. Martha went about her daily routines with the same diligence, but inside, a warm flame of hope flickered where only resignation had lived before. She found herself glancing toward the windows more often, her heart quickening at the sight of any tall figure walking down Main Street. 3 days after the massage incident, as Martha was arranging a display of winter coats, she noticed a small bouquet of wildflowers sitting on the counter near the cash box: mountain asters, Indian paintbrush, and delicate columbines, flowers that grew only in the high meadows where few people ventured. They were arranged simply in a mason jar, their purple and orange petals bringing unexpected beauty to the practical surroundings of the store. "Where did these come from?" she asked Mr. Henley when he emerged from his office. He glanced at the flowers with mild annoyance. "Someone left them this morning before I opened. Probably meant for you, though I can't imagine why anyone would clutter up my counter with weeds." Martha's pulse quickened. She touched one delicate petal, marveling at the thought that someone had climbed high into the mountains to gather these for her. The gesture spoke of effort and intention, of someone thinking about her comfort and happiness during their solitary wanderings. "They're beautiful," she whispered, more to herself than to Mr. Henley. "If you say so. Just keep them out of the way of customers." Throughout the morning, Martha found her gaze drawn to the wildflower bouquet. Each bloom represented miles of mountain trails, steep climbs, and careful selection. Someone had thought her worthy of such effort, such beauty. The realization filled her with a giddiness she hadn't felt since childhood. When the lunch hour arrived, Martha took her usual break on the back steps, but this time she wasn't alone. Silas McGraw sat on a wooden crate nearby, whittling a piece of pine with a sharp knife. The sight of him made her stomach flutter with nervous excitement. "Thank you for the flowers," she said softly. "They're the most beautiful thing anyone's ever given me." Silas looked up from his carving, his dark eyes warm. "Figured you might like some color in that place. Store's too gray for someone like you." "Someone like me?" Martha asked, curious about his meaning. "Someone with kindness in her heart," he replied, returning to his whittling. "Kindness deserves beauty." They sat in comfortable silence for several minutes, Martha watching the careful movements of his hands as he shaped the wood. There was something mesmerizing about his skill, the way he coaxed form from raw material with patient precision. "What are you making?" she asked. Silas held up the partially carved piece, a small bird taking shape from the pine. "Robin," he said, "reminds me of spring, of new beginnings." The symbolism wasn't lost on Martha. New beginnings seemed like a luxury she had never been able to afford, but sitting here with this enigmatic man, she began to believe such things might be possible. "Do you come to town often?" she asked, hungry for details about his life in the mountains. "Not often," Silas admitted. "Most times I get what I need and head back up. But lately," he paused, his knife stilling in his hands, "lately I find reasons to linger." The admission hung between them, loaded with meaning that made Martha's cheeks warm. She had become a reason for this legendary man to linger in the town that held little appeal for someone of his independence and strength. "The townspeople talk about you," she said carefully. "They say you fought in the war." Silas's expression darkened slightly. "People say a lot of things. Most of them aren't worth repeating." Martha sensed pain beneath his reluctance to discuss. The past, the kind of deep hurt that drove men to seek solitude in wild places. She didn't press, understanding that some stories couldn't be rushed. "I've never been to war," she said instead, "but I know something about wanting to escape. Sometimes I dream about walking into those mountains and never coming back." "What stops you?" Silas asked, genuinely curious. Martha considered the question seriously. "Fear, I suppose. Fear of being alone, of not knowing how to survive. And maybe fear that even in the mountains I'd still be me." "Nothing wrong with being you," Silas said firmly. "World's got plenty of people trying to be someone else. Not enough folks comfortable in their own skin." The simple statement struck Martha like a revelation. She had spent so much energy trying to minimize herself, to take up less space and cause less trouble. The idea that someone might value her authentic self seemed almost too good to believe. Their conversation was interrupted by the sound of approaching voices. Mrs. Henderson and Mrs. Patterson rounded the corner, their faces set in expressions of scandalized concern. They stopped short at the sight of Martha and Silas sitting together, their disapproval palpable in the mountain air. "Martha," Mrs. Henderson said, in the tone one might use with a wayward child, "we need to speak with you." Martha felt her cheeks burn as she stood, suddenly self-conscious about the intimate nature of their conversation. "Good afternoon, ladies. Is there something I can help you with?" "Indeed there is," Mrs. Patterson said, her eyes flicking meaningfully toward Silas. "We're concerned about the company you're keeping. It's not appropriate for a respectable woman to be seen with certain individuals." Silas rose slowly, his considerable height and breadth making both women take an involuntary step backward. His expression remained calm, but Martha could sense the steel beneath his quiet demeanor. "Ladies," he said with exaggerated politeness, touching the brim of his hat, "I was just keeping Miss Caldwell company during her lunch break. Nothing improper about conversation." "Nevertheless," Mrs. Henderson said, her voice tight with barely controlled indignation, "people are talking. A woman in Martha's position can't afford to have her reputation questioned." "What position would that be?" Silas asked, his tone deceptively mild. The question hung in the air like a challenge. Martha understood the cruel implication, that as an unmarried woman of her size and station, she should be grateful for any attention and careful not to aim above her proper place in society's hierarchy. "We simply want what's best for Martha," Mrs. Patterson said, though her concern felt more like control. "Then you should want her to be happy," Silas replied. "Seems to me that's the best thing for anyone." The two women exchanged glances, clearly unused to having their authority questioned so directly. They had expected to shame Martha into compliance, but Silas's presence complicated their usual tactics. "Well," Mrs. Henderson said stiffly, "we've said our piece. Martha, I hope you'll consider the wisdom of our words." After they left, Martha felt the familiar weight of judgment settling on her shoulders. The brief joy of Silas's company was tainted by the reminder of her precarious social position. "I'm sorry about that," she said quietly. "They mean well, I think, but they mean to control you," Silas interrupted gently. "There's a difference between caring for someone and trying to keep them small." His words struck home with uncomfortable accuracy. Martha had spent years accepting the limitations others imposed on her dreams and desires, mistaking their constraints for protection. "Maybe they're right, though," she said, voicing her deepest fear. "Maybe I am reaching too high." Silas moved closer, his presence warm and solid. "Martha Caldwell, you're one of the strongest, kindest people I've ever met. Anyone who can't see your worth isn't looking hard enough." The carved robin appeared in her hands, smooth and warm from his touch. It was beautiful in its simplicity, a gift that spoke of new beginnings and the courage to take flight. That evening, Martha sat in her small room, turning the carved robin over in her hands, while fingering her mother's silver locket. The delicate piece of jewelry was one of her few remaining connections to the family she'd lost, worn close to her heart for more than a decade. Inside the oval frame were tiny portraits of her parents, their young faces frozen in happier times. She had never shared the locket with anyone, never spoken of the memories it held or the loneliness it represented. But something about Silas's genuine interest in her thoughts and feelings made her want to open that carefully guarded part of herself. The next day brought an unusual request from Mr. Henley. A wealthy rancher from the valley needed supplies delivered to his remote homestead, and the regular delivery boy had taken ill. The job required someone strong enough to handle the heavy wagon and reliable enough to make the treacherous mountain journey alone. "I know it's not usual work for you, Martha," Mr. Henley said, counting out the extra wages, "but you're the only person I trust with valuable cargo. Besides, you know these mountains better than most folks realize." Martha accepted the assignment eagerly, partly for the additional money, but mostly for the chance to escape the town's watchful eyes for a day. The morning was crisp and clear, as she loaded the wagon with barrels of flour, cases of ammunition, and various household goods. The familiar ache in her legs felt manageable after Silas's attention, and she found herself looking forward to the solitude of the mountain trail. She was securing the last rope when a familiar voice called her name. Silas emerged from the shadow of a nearby building, his expression concerned. "Heard you're making the run to Patterson's ranch," he said. "That's rough country for anyone traveling alone." "I can handle it," Martha replied, though she appreciated his concern. "Made the trip twice before without trouble." "Trail's been washed out by the recent rains," Silas said. "You'll need to take the upper route through Devil's Canyon. Gets tricky this time of year." He stepped closer to the wagon, his experienced eyes assessing the load and the route ahead. Martha found herself studying his face, noting the way, mourning. Light caught the silver threads in his dark hair and beard. "Mind if I ride along?" he asked. "Got business in that direction anyway, and 2 sets of eyes are better than 1 in canyon country." Martha's heart leaped at the prospect of spending hours in his company, away from the prying eyes and wagging tongues of Timber Ridge. "I'd welcome the company," she said, trying to keep her voice casual. The wagon trail wound upward through stands of pine and aspen, the air growing thinner and cooler as they climbed. Silas proved to be an ideal traveling companion, his knowledge of the mountains evident in every observation about weather patterns, animal tracks, and the safest routes through challenging terrain. "You know this country well," Martha observed. As they navigated a particularly steep section of trail, "Spent most of the last 8 years up here," Silas replied, his hands steady on the reins. "After the war ended, I needed someplace quiet to figure out who I was supposed to be." The admission opened a door Martha had been hoping to find. "The war changed you?" Silas was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. When he finally spoke, his voice carried the weight of old pain. "I was a different man when I went to fight," he said. "Believed in causes and glory, thought I understood what courage meant. By the time it ended, I'd seen things no person should see, done things that still wake me up at night." Martha reached into her dress and withdrew the silver locket, holding it carefully in her palm. "I lost my parents when I was 16, she said softly. "Fever took them both within a week. This is all I have left of them." She opened the locket to reveal the tiny portraits inside. Silas glanced at the miniature faces, his expression softening with understanding. "They look like good people," he said. "You have your mother's eyes. Everyone said I was lucky to survive," Martha continued, surprised by her own courage in sharing. "Such private pain. Lucky to inherit enough money to start over somewhere new. But I never felt lucky. I felt abandoned, like the world had forgotten I existed." "I know that feeling," Silas said quietly. "Like you're living in the spaces between other people's lives, watching but never quite belonging." They reached a scenic overlook where the trail widened enough to rest the horses. The valley spread below them in autumn glory, gold and red leaves. painting the mountainsides in brilliant color. Martha had seen such views before, but sharing this one with Silas made it feel new and precious. "Why did you help me that day?" she asked as they shared water and hardtack from her supply bag. "With my legs, I mean. No one else ever noticed I was hurting." Silas considered the question while watching a hawk circle overhead. "My mother was a big woman," he said finally. "Strong as any man, worked harder than most. But I watched how people treated her, saw the way they looked past her like she didn't matter. She deserved better, and so do you." The simple statement brought tears to Martha's eyes. Someone understood. Someone saw the person she was, beneath the assumptions and judgments of others. "I've never talked about my parents with anyone," she admitted. "Never found someone who seemed interested in listening. Grief needs witnesses," Silas said gently. "Can't heal in silence." As they resumed their journey, Martha found herself sharing stories she had kept locked away for years. She told him about her mother's beautiful singing voice, her father's skill with woodworking, the little house where they'd been happy before illness destroyed everything. Silas listened with genuine attention, asking thoughtful questions and sharing his own memories of family lost to time and circumstance. The hours passed quickly in such companionship. When they reached Patterson's ranch, the rancher greeted them, with surprise at seeing the notorious mountain man accompanying the store clerk. But Silas's reputation commanded respect, and the business was conducted efficiently. On the return journey, as shadows lengthened across the mountain trail, Martha felt a contentment she had never experienced. The weight of solitude that had pressed on her for so long seemed lighter when shared with someone who understood its burden. "Martha," Silas said as they approached the outskirts of town, "would you consider taking a walk with me tomorrow evening? There's a place up near Willow Creek where the aspens are turning. Beautiful this time of year." The invitation sent warmth flooding through her chest. "I'd like that very much." But even as she agreed, Martha felt the familiar shadow of doubt creeping in. Tomorrow they would return to the world of watching eyes and critical tongues, where a woman like her walking with a man like him would be seen as presumptuous at best. As if reading her thoughts, Silas said, "Don't let other people's small thinking make you smaller, Martha. You deserve beauty in your life, deserve to be seen and appreciated." The locket felt warm against her chest as they rolled into Timber Ridge, carrying with it new meaning. No longer just a reminder of loss, it had become a symbol of trust shared and connections forged. For the first time since her parents' death, Martha felt like she belonged somewhere, not in a place, but in the space between two people who understood each other's pain and saw each other's worth. The walk to Willow Creek revealed a side of Silas that Martha had only glimpsed before. Away from the judgmental eyes of town, he moved with the quiet confidence of a man completely at home in the wilderness. He pointed out animal tracks, identified bird calls, and shared stories about the changing seasons in the high country. "This is my church," he said, as they reached a grove where golden aspen leaves shimmered in the evening light. "More peace here than I ever found in any building." Martha understood completely. The cathedral of trees, with its carpet of fallen leaves and canopy open to the darkening sky, felt more sacred than any sanctuary she had known. Here, surrounded by natural beauty and Silas's gentle presence, she felt closer to something divine than she ever had, sitting in judgment-filled pews. They found a fallen log to serve as a bench, and Martha was surprised when Silas sat close enough that their shoulders touched. The contact sent warmth through her entire body, a reminder that she was a woman capable of desire, not just the sexless workhorse others saw her as. "There's something I should tell you," Silas said, his voice carrying an unusual tension. "About why I really came to these mountains." Martha turned to face him more fully, sensing the importance of whatever revelation was coming. In the fading light, his weathered features looked younger, more vulnerable. "I told you the war changed me," he continued, "but I didn't tell you how. The things I saw, the orders I followed, they broke something inside me that I'm not sure. Can be fixed. He reached into his vest pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft leather. When he unfolded the cloth, Martha saw a military medal, its bronze surface tarnished, but still bearing the proud eagle and shield of commendation. For valor. They gave me this for saving my unit during a battle near Antietam, Silas said, his voice heavy with old pain. What they don't know is that I froze up when the shooting started. Couldn't move, couldn't think, just stood there while men died. Around me. Martha studied the medal, trying to reconcile this story of paralysis with the confident, capable man beside her. But you saved them, she said gently. Eventually, Silas admitted. But not before I watched my best friend take a bullet. Meant for me. Tommy Morrison from Ohio, barely 19 years old. He died because I couldn't do my job when it mattered. The pain in his voice was raw and immediate, as if the wound had never properly healed. Martha understood now why he had sought the solitude of the mountains, why he carried himself with the careful control of a man who didn't trust his own reactions under pressure. Is that why you stay away from people? She asked. Partly, Silas said, turning the medal over in his calloused hands, but mostly because I'm afraid of what I might do if I care about someone and fail them the way I failed Tommy. Martha felt her heart breaking for this strong man who carried such unnecessary guilt. Without thinking, she reached out and covered his hands with hers, stilling their restless movement. You didn't fail me the day you helped with my legs, she said firmly. You saw someone in pain and you acted. That's not the behavior of a coward. Silas looked at their joined hands, his expression conflicted. That was different. No danger, no pressure, just simple kindness. Kindness takes courage too, Martha insisted, especially when everyone's watching and judging. You risked your reputation to help someone society says doesn't matter. They sat in silence as darkness gathered around them, the medal gleaming faintly between their intertwined fingers. Martha felt honored that he had trusted her with such a painful secret, understanding that few people had been allowed to see this vulnerable side of the legendary mountain man. I've never told anyone about Tommy, Silas said eventually. Never even spoken his name aloud since the war ended. What was he like? Martha asked gently. Silas's face softened with memory. Full of dreams about the farm he was going to buy when he got home. Talked constantly about this girl he was going to marry, Sarah something or other. He carried her picture everywhere, showed it to anyone who'd look. He sounds like a good friend. The best, Silas agreed. He used to say that the war would end someday, but the friendships we made would last forever. Guess he was right, just not the way he meant. As they walked back toward town, Martha found herself studying Silas with new understanding. The careful way he moved, the constant awareness of his surroundings, the slight tension that never quite left his shoulders, all signs of a man still fighting an internal war years after the external one had ended. I have something for you. Two, Martha said when they reached the outskirts of Timber Ridge. She had been carrying the decision with her all evening, and his openness about his past gave her the courage to follow through. From her reticule, she withdrew a small bundle, wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a pair of warm wool socks she had knitted in the evenings by lamplight, using the finest yarn she could afford. Your boots looked worn when you knelt to help me, she explained, suddenly shy about the intimate nature of the gift. I thought you might need something warm for the mountain winters. Silas accepted the socks with obvious emotion, his large hands gentle as he examined her careful stitching. These are beautiful, Martha. No one's made me anything by hand since my mother died. The admission revealed another layer of loneliness in his carefully constructed solitude. Martha realized that in reaching out to help her, Silas had been reaching toward human connection he'd denied himself for years. Their evening ended with a gentle kiss under the lamplight at the corner of Main Street. It was Martha's first kiss, tender and sweet and nothing like the rough advances she had sometimes imagined from the men who ignored her. Silas kissed her as if she were precious, as if her lips were something to be treasured rather than taken. "Good night, Martha," he said, softly, his forehead resting briefly against hers. Good night, Silas. Martha walked home with her heart singing, the memory of his kiss warm on her lips and his medal heavy in her pocket, a token of trust that marked the deepening of their connection. But as she climbed the stairs to her room, she noticed the curtains twitching in several windows along Main Street. Their kiss had not gone unobserved. The next morning brought consequences. Mr. Henley waited for her at the store entrance, his usually genial face set in lines of disapproval. "Martha, we need to discuss your conduct," he said without preamble. "Mrs. Henderson paid me a visit last evening. She's concerned about your association with that mountain man." Martha felt her stomach drop, though she had been expecting this. Conversation since the moment Mrs. Henderson had discovered them together. "Mr. McGraw has been nothing but respectful," she said carefully. "I don't see how my friendship with him affects my work." "It affects your reputation," Mr. Henley replied, firmly, "and by extension, the reputation of this establishment. I can't have customers uncomfortable about the character of my employees." The unfairness of it stung deeply. Martha had worked faithfully for 5 years, never missing a day, never giving less than her complete effort. But one evening walk with a man deemed unsuitable could erase all her dedication and service. "Are you dismissing me?" she asked, her voice steadier than she felt. "Not yet," Mr. Henley said, "but you need to understand the position you're putting me in. If this association continues, I'll have no choice but to find someone more suitable for the position." Martha nodded, understanding the ultimatum clearly. Choose Silas and lose her livelihood, or give up the first real happiness she had known and maintain her precarious place in Timber Ridge society. As she began her morning duties, the medal in her apron pocket felt heavier than ever, a reminder of the courage required not just for single moments of heroism, but for the daily choice to live authentically despite the cost. For 3 days, Martha avoided the back steps during her lunch break, taking her meals in the store's cramped office. Instead, she threw herself into work with desperate energy, arriving early and staying late, as if perfect performance could somehow shield her from the town's disapproval. But the strategy proved futile. Mrs. Henderson arrived on Thursday morning with 2 other church ladies in tow, their faces set in expressions of righteous concern. They waited until the store was empty of other customers before approaching the counter where Martha was organizing inventory. "We've come to speak with you as friends," Mrs. Henderson began, though her tone suggested anything but friendship. "About the path you're choosing and where it leads." Martha's hands stilled on the ledger she'd been updating. "I'm not sure what you mean." "Oh, I think you do," said Mrs. Patterson, stepping forward with the confidence of someone accustomed to having her opinions respected. "This inappropriate attachment to that wild man from the mountains, it's causing talk throughout the town." The third woman, Mrs. Cooper, from Martha's own boarding house, nodded gravely. "I've seen him lurking around the property at odd hours. It's making my other tenants uncomfortable." Martha felt heat rise in her cheeks. Silas had never come to the boarding house, had never been anywhere near it. The accusation was a complete fabrication designed to pressure her through shame and fear. "That's not true," Martha said quietly but firmly. "Mr. McGraw has never been to the boarding house." "Nevertheless," Mrs. Henderson continued, "your association with him is unseemly. A woman in your position needs to be more careful about her reputation." There it was again, that phrase about her position, the cruel reminder that someone like Martha should be grateful for any crumbs of acceptance society might offer. "My position?" Martha asked, surprising herself with the steel in her voice. "And what position would that be?" The 3 women exchanged glances, clearly uncomfortable with having to state their assumptions aloud. Mrs. Patterson cleared her throat delicately. "Well, dear, you're not a young woman anymore, and your circumstances don't offer many opportunities for marriage. It would be wise to focus on stability rather than romantic fantasies." The words hit Martha like physical blows, each one designed to remind her of her limitations and proper place. She had heard such sentiments all her life, wrapped in false kindness and delivered with patronizing smiles. "Perhaps," Mrs. Cooper added, You should consider the kindness Mr. Henley has shown in keeping you employed. Such loyalty shouldn't be jeopardized for a fleeting infatuation. Martha understood the threat clearly. These women had the power to pressure Mr. Henley, to make her position untenable through whispered campaigns and withdrawn patronage. They were offering her a choice: conform or be destroyed. I appreciate your concern, Martha said carefully, but my friendships are my own business, not when they affect the entire community. Mrs. Henderson snapped, her facade of kindness slipping. That man is dangerous. He's killed people in the war, lived like an animal in those mountains. What could he possibly want with someone like you except— She didn't finish the sentence, but the implication hung in the air like poison. Martha felt something crack inside her chest, not from the woman's cruelty, but from the realization that she had spent years accepting such treatment as normal. You should leave, Martha said, her voice growing stronger. This is a place of business, not a gossip parlor. The women departed in a rustle of indignant skirts, but their words lingered, like smoke in the store's air. Martha finished the morning's work in a haze of hurt and anger, her hands moving automatically while her mind churned with emotions she'd kept buried for too long. When lunchtime arrived, she found herself walking to the back steps despite her recent avoidance. Silas was there waiting, whittling another small figure from a piece of cedar. The sight of him, solid, patient, real, brought unexpected tears to her eyes. "Rough morning?" he asked gently, setting aside his carving. Martha sat beside him heavily, the weight of the town's disapproval pressing down on her shoulders. "They came to warn me about you. Said you were dangerous, that I was making a fool of myself." Silas's jaw tightened, but his voice remained calm. "What did you tell them?" "That my friendships were my own business," Martha said, then laughed bitterly. "Though I'm not sure how much longer that will be true. Mr. Henley's already made his position clear." "I'm sorry," Silas said quietly. "I never wanted to cause you trouble." "You didn't cause anything," Martha replied fiercely. "They did, with their small minds and smaller hearts." Silas reached into his pack and withdrew something wrapped in soft cloth. When he unfolded it, Martha saw a beautiful quilt square, hand-sewn with intricate patterns in blues and greens that reminded her of mountain lakes. "My mother started this. Before she died," he said, placing it gently in Martha's hands. "Never got to finish it, but I kept the pieces, thinking someday I might find someone worthy of having it completed." Martha traced the careful stitching with her fingertips, overwhelmed by the significance of the gift. "Silas, I can't." "You can," he interrupted gently. "You're the finest seamstress I've ever seen, and more than that, you understand what it means to create something beautiful from scraps others might discard." The metaphor wasn't lost on Martha. Like the quilt pieces, she and Silas were remnants that others had dismissed, the broken soldier, the unmarriageable woman. But together, they might create something whole and beautiful. "There's something else," Silas said, his expression growing serious. "I've been thinking about what you said, about dreaming of walking into the mountains and never coming back." Martha's heart began to race at the implication in his words. "I have a cabin up near Bear Creek," he continued. "Nothing fancy, but it's warm and private, with good water and plenty of game. Big enough for two people who don't mind each other's and company." The proposal hung between them, unspoken but understood. He was offering her escape from the town's judgment, a chance to build a life free from others' expectations and limitations. "I don't know anything about mountain living," Martha said, though her heart was already reaching toward the possibility. "I could teach you," Silas replied. "Hunting, preserving food, reading weather signs. You're stronger and smarter than anyone gives you credit for." Martha looked down at the quilt square in her hands, seeing in its unfinished state a reflection of her own life. She had accepted incompleteness for so long, convinced herself that partial existence was all someone like her deserved. "When?" she asked quietly. "Soon," Silas said. "Before the snows come and the passes close, we could leave quietly, take only what matters most." As Martha walked back to the store, the quilt square hidden in her apron pocket, she felt the weight of decisions settling on her shoulders. Behind her lay the familiar prison of others' expectations and judgments. Ahead stretched the unknown territory of authentic life, dangerous but honest. That evening she began sewing by lamplight, her needle working steadily to complete what Silas's mother had started. Each stitch felt like a choice, a commitment to the possibility of wholeness. The quilt would be finished soon, and with it her old life in Timber Ridge would end. The courage Silas had found too late on the battlefield, Martha was discovering in the quiet revolution of refusing to remain. Small for others' comfort, tomorrow would bring new challenges, but tonight she sewed toward freedom. Martha spent the weekend completing the quilt, her fingers working steadily by candlelight in her small room. Each stitch brought her closer to a decision that felt both terrifying and inevitable. The mountain pattern emerged beautifully under her careful hands, blues and greens flowing together like water over stone. Monday morning brought an unexpected visitor to the general store. A tall, sharp-faced man in a dark suit stood examining the merchandise with the calculating gaze of someone accustomed to evaluating worth. He moved with the predatory grace Martha had sometimes observed in wolves, all contained violence and watchful intelligence. "Can I help you find something?" Martha asked politely, though something about the stranger made her uncomfortable. "Perhaps," the man replied, his voice carrying a slight accent she couldn't place. "I'm looking for information about a man who might be living in these mountains. Goes by the name Silas McGraw." Martha's blood turned cold, but she kept her expression carefully neutral. "I'm afraid I don't know anyone by that name." The man smiled, but it didn't reach his pale eyes. "Really? That's curious, because several people in town have mentioned seeing you with a mountain man who matches his description perfectly." Before Martha could respond, the store door opened again. Mr. Henley entered with two more strangers, both bearing the same hard-edged look as the first man. One carried a leather portfolio, while the other kept his hand resting casually on the butt of a holstered pistol. "Miss Caldwell," Mr. Henley said nervously, "these gentlemen are here on official business. They're bounty hunters from back east." Martha's knees nearly buckled. Bounty hunters meant Silas was wanted for something serious, something that had sent professional killers across the country to find him. The man with the portfolio opened it and withdrew a yellowed poster. Martha found herself staring at a younger version of Silas's face, clean-shaven, but unmistakably him. The words at the top made her stomach lurch. "Wanted for desertion and murder." Sergeant Silas McGraw, the first bounty hunter said conversationally, disappeared from his unit 3 days before the Battle of Chancellorsville. Found his commanding officer dead in his tent the night before, shot through the head. Army's been looking for him ever since. "That's not possible," Martha said before she could stop herself. "He saved his unit at Antietam. He has a medal." "Ah," the bounty hunter said with satisfaction. "So you do know him. How interesting that he's been telling stories about heroism when the truth is quite different." Martha's mind reeled. Everything Silas had told her about the war, about Tommy Morrison, about his cowardice and guilt, was all of it lies. Had she been deceived by a deserter and murderer? "The Army's offering $500 for McGraw's capture," the second bounty hunter added. "Dead or alive. We've been tracking him for years, following reports of a man matching his description living rough in various mountain territories. We know he's been seen with you regularly." The first man continued smoothly. "We also know mountain men don't come down from their hiding places without good reason. You've become his weakness, Miss Caldwell." The words hit Martha like physical blows. She had thought she was finally worthy of someone's attention, but instead she had become nothing more than a tool to be used against Silas. The humiliation was almost as crushing as the fear. "We don't want to harm you," the bounty hunter said, his tone deceptively gentle. "But we need you to help us arrange a meeting, somewhere private where McGraw won't suspect a trap." "I won't," Martha said, finding her voice despite the terror coursing through her veins. "I won't help you hunt him." The man's expression hardened. "I'm afraid you don't understand the situation. McGraw is a dangerous fugitive who's killed at least one man, possibly more. If you're harboring him, you're breaking federal law." Mr. Henley stepped forward, his face pale but determined. "Now, see here, Martha's a respectable woman. She wouldn't knowingly associate with a criminal, wouldn't she?" the bounty hunter asked, his gaze never leaving Martha's face. "Tell me, Miss Caldwell, has McGraw ever mentioned his past? Ever talked about the war, about why he came to these mountains?" Martha's silence was answer enough. The bounty hunter nodded with satisfaction. "He's been lying to you from the beginning," he said, "using your affection to stay hidden, to avoid justice. Men like McGraw are experts at manipulation, at finding lonely women who'll protect them out of misguided loyalty." The cruel assessment cut deep because it echoed Martha's own fears about her worthiness. Had Silas really cared for her, or had she simply been convenient camouflage for a fugitive? "You have until sunset tomorrow," the bounty hunter said, producing a business card from his vest pocket. "Send word to us at the hotel when you're ready to cooperate. Otherwise, we'll assume you're an accomplice and treat you accordingly." After they left, Martha sank onto a stool behind the counter, her legs no longer able to support her weight. The wanted poster lay on the counter like an accusation. Silas's younger face staring up at her with eyes that held secrets she was only now beginning to understand. "I'm sorry, Martha," Mr. Henley said quietly. "I had no choice but to bring them here. They knew about your association already." Martha nodded numbly. She understood the position everyone was in, caught between federal law and personal loyalties, between safety and conscience. The rest of the day passed in a haze of routine actions, performed by rote, while her mind struggled to process the morning's revelations. Customers came and went, unaware that the quiet clerk serving them was grappling with impossible choices and devastating betrayals. When closing time arrived, Martha locked the store with trembling hands and walked slowly toward the mountains. She needed to find Silas, needed to hear his side of the story before the bounty hunters closed their trap. But with each step, doubt gnawed at her heart. Had she been living in a fantasy, believing herself worthy of genuine love when she was actually nothing more than a useful fool? The trail to Silas's usual evening spot seemed longer than ever, each switchback bringing her closer to answers she wasn't sure she wanted to hear. When she finally reached the grove where they had shared their first kiss, she found him waiting with the patience of a man accustomed to solitude. "Martha," he said, rising from the log where he'd been sitting, "you look troubled." She pulled the wanted poster from her reticule and held it out to him. Silas took one look at the yellowed paper, and his face went white beneath his beard. "Where did you get this?" he asked quietly. "Bounty hunters," Martha replied, her voice barely above a whisper. "They came to the store today. They know about us, Silas. They want me to help them trap you." Silas sank back onto the log, the poster crinkling in his hands. For a long moment the only sound was wind through the aspens and the distant cry of a night bird. "Is it true?" Martha asked, the question tearing at her throat. "Did you desert? Did you kill your commanding officer?" Silas looked up at her with eyes full of pain and something else, a desperate hope that she might understand, might see past the accusations to the truth beneath. "Yes and no," he said finally. "The facts are true, but the story they tell isn't." Martha waited, her heart suspended between love and betrayal, between trust and the terrible possibility that everything she'd believed had been a lie. "I did leave my unit," Silas continued, his voice heavy with old pain. "And Colonel Harrison died the night before I disappeared. But I didn't murder him, Martha. I killed him to stop him from murdering others." The distinction hit Martha like a revelation. Not murder, but justice. Not cowardice, but courage of a different kind than she had imagined. "Tell me," she said, settling beside him on the log. "Tell me everything. And in the gathering darkness, with bounty hunters closing in and impossible choices looming, Silas began to share the real story of what had driven him to the mountains and what price they would both have to pay for the truth. In the fading light of evening, Silas told Martha the story he had never shared with another living soul. His voice was steady but haunted as he described the horror that had driven him from the war and into the wilderness. Colonel Harrison was selling information to Confederate forces, Silas began, his hands working nervously at a piece of bark. Battle plans, troop movements, supply routes. Men were dying because of his betrayal, but he was careful, smart about covering his tracks. Martha listened in horrified silence as Silas described discovering coded messages in the colonel's belongings, witnessing clandestine meetings with enemy agents, and realizing that their next battle would be a massacre because Harrison had revealed their positions. I tried going through proper channels, Silas continued, reported my suspicions to other officers, but Harrison was popular, well-connected. They thought I was suffering from battle fatigue, seeing enemies where none existed. So you took matters into your own hands, Martha said quietly. I confronted him the night before Chancellorsville, showed him the evidence I'd gathered, demanded he confess. He laughed, said no one would believe a common soldier over a decorated colonel. Silas's voice grew harder. Then he pulled his pistol, said I knew too much to live. Martha could picture the scene. Two men alone in a tent, one desperate to stop a betrayal, the other willing to kill to protect his treachery. We fought for the gun, Silas said. It went off during the struggle. Harrison died instantly and I was left holding a smoking pistol with no way to prove what really happened. The evidence you gathered, Harrison had destroyed it during a fight. Without proof, I was just a soldier who'd killed his commanding officer. They would have court-martialed me and hanged me as an example to others. The injustice of it struck Martha deeply. Silas had tried to save lives and been branded a murderer for his efforts. No wonder he carried such guilt, such fear of failing. Others, when it mattered most. You saved your unit by running, she said with sudden understanding. If you'd stayed to face charges, Harrison's betrayal would have remained hidden. More men would have died. Silas nodded grimly. Chancellorsville was still a bloodbath. But at least our boys weren't walking into a complete trap, small comfort for the families of those who died anyway. They sat in contemplative silence as full darkness settled around them. Martha understood. Now why Silas had chosen isolation, why he struggled with trusting his own judgment under pressure. He had made an impossible choice and spent 8 years paying the price. What will you do now? Martha asked. They're not going to give up. These men hunt fugitives for a living. I don't know, Silas admitted. I've been running for so long, I'm not sure I remember how to do anything else. Martha felt a surge of protectiveness that surprised her with its intensity. This man had sacrificed everything to prevent greater evil, and the world had repaid him with exile and pursuit. She wouldn't let him face this alone. There has to be another way, she said firmly. Someone who knew Harrison, someone who might have suspected his betrayal. The war's been over for years. Surely tongues have loosened. Evidence has emerged. Silas shook his head. Even if that were true, how would we find such evidence? And why would anyone believe it now? Martha stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the grove as her mind raced. There had to be something, some angle they hadn't considered. Then inspiration struck like lightning. Your friend Tommy Morrison, she said, turning back to face him. You said he was from Ohio, that he talked about a girl named Sarah. If he survived Chancellorsville, if he's still alive, he didn't survive, Silas interrupted sadly. I heard about his death from other soldiers before I deserted. Took a Confederate bullet to the chest 2 days after Harrison died. Martha's excitement dimmed, then flared again. But what about the girl? Sarah, whatever her name was. Tommy might have written to her about what was happening in the unit, about suspicious behavior he'd noticed. That's a long shot, Martha. 8 years is a lifetime, and we don't even know her full name or where she lived. Morrison, Ohio, Martha said with growing confidence. Small towns keep records, remember families. It's worth trying. Silas stared at her with something approaching wonder. You're serious about this? I'm serious about you, Martha replied simply. About us? I won't let you run anymore, Silas McGraw. We're going to clear your name or die trying. The declaration hung between them, bold and dangerous and absolutely sincere. Martha had spent her whole life accepting limitations, but faced with losing the man she loved, she discovered reserves of courage she never knew she possessed. The bounty hunters gave me until sunset tomorrow to cooperate, she continued, her mind already forming plans. That gives us maybe 18 hours to find evidence or get away. Get away where? Silas asked. They've been tracking me for years. There's nowhere left to run. Then we don't run, Martha said with sudden inspiration. We make our stand right here. In these mountains you know better than anyone. We use their confidence against them. Silas was quiet for a long moment, considering. When he spoke, his voice carried a note of hope that had been absent for years. You're talking about a fight, Martha. These men are professionals, killers. If we resist and lose, then we lose together. Martha interrupted. But if we don't fight, you lose anyway, and I lose you. At least this way we have a chance. That night, they returned to Silas's cabin high in the mountains. The simple log structure sat in a natural clearing, surrounded by towering pines and protected by steep approaches that would make it difficult to attack. Martha could see why Silas had chosen this place. It offered both concealment and defensive advantages. Inside, the cabin was spartanly furnished, but comfortable, with a stone fireplace, a small kitchen area, and sleeping quarters separated by a curtain. Everything spoke of a man who had learned to live with only what was essential. We need supplies, Silas said, already moving with the purposeful energy of a soldier preparing for battle. Food, ammunition, medical supplies in case someone gets hurt. Martha nodded, catching his infectious determination. I can get supplies from the store tonight, after everyone's asleep. Mr. Henley keeps extra keys in his office. That's stealing, Silas pointed out. That's survival, Martha corrected. I'll leave money to cover whatever we take. They spent hours planning their strategy, taking advantage of Silas's military training and intimate knowledge of the mountain terrain. The cabin's location offered several escape routes if needed, but more importantly, it forced any attackers to approach uphill through difficult terrain. Your hunting rifle, Martha said, examining the weapon Silas had reluctantly retrieved from. Storage. How accurate are you with it? Accurate enough, Silas replied grimly, though I was hoping never to use it on another human being. Sometimes we don't get to choose, Martha said, echoing words he had spoken to her about kindness and courage. As dawn approached, they made their way back toward town to gather supplies. The streets were empty in the pre-dawn darkness, but Martha felt eyes watching from shadowed windows. News of the bounty hunter's arrival had spread quickly through the small community. At the general store, Martha used her key to enter quietly, moving by memory through the familiar aisles. She gathered ammunition for Silas's rifle, medical supplies, dried foods that would keep well, and other essentials for what might be an extended siege. When she emerged, Silas was waiting with 2 horses and a pack mule borrowed from a sympathetic rancher who owed him a favor. They loaded the supplies quickly and efficiently, working with the wordless coordination of partners who trusted each other completely. Are you sure about this? Silas asked as they prepared to return to the mountains. There's still time for you to stay out of it, to claim ignorance when they come looking. Martha looked at the town where she had spent 5 years accepting limitations and living small. Then she looked at the man who had seen her worth when no one else would, who had shown her that courage came in many forms. I've never been more sure of anything in my life, she said, swinging up onto her horse with surprising grace. As they rode toward the mountains with the first light of dawn breaking over the peaks, Martha felt something she had never experienced before, the fierce joy of choosing her own fate. Win or lose, she would face what came as herself, fully and completely, beside the man who had taught her that love was worth any risk. Behind them, Timber Ridge stirred to life, unaware that by evening, the quiet drama playing out in their midst would reach its violent conclusion. The bounty hunters would come, confident in their numbers and professional expertise, but they would discover that sometimes the hunted possessed advantages their pursuers never anticipated. The mountains held their breath, waiting for the storm that was coming. The bounty hunters arrived at sunset just as promised. Martha watched them through Silas's field glasses from a concealed position above the cabin, counting 3 horses picking their way up the steep trail. They moved with the confidence of men who had tracked countless fugitives, but their city, clothes and heavy gear marked them as outsiders in this harsh terrain. "They're coming up the main trail," Martha whispered to Silas, who was positioned behind a fallen log with his rifle ready. "Single file, taking their time." "Good," Silas replied quietly. "That trail forces them into the open for the last 100 yards. No cover, no way to approach unseen." Martha had never imagined she would be planning an armed confrontation, but the past 24 hours had transformed her understanding of what she was capable of. In her hand, she gripped the kitchen knife she had brought from the store, a simple tool that had become her weapon of last resort. The lead bounty hunter called out when they reached the base of the clearing. "McGraw, we know you're up there. Come down peaceful-like and nobody has to get hurt." Silas remained silent, letting them wonder about his exact position. Martha could see the frustration in their body language as they scanned the tree line for signs of movement. "We've got your woman," the second man shouted, though Martha could see all 3 of them clearly positioned below the cabin. "Miss Caldwell decided to cooperate after all, told us right where to find you." The lie was designed to shake Silas's confidence, to make him doubt Martha's loyalty. But Martha felt only cold anger at the manipulation. These men understood nothing about the bond that had formed between her and Silas. "You're going to have to come get me," Silas finally called back, his voice echoing off the canyon walls. "But I should warn you, I've got the high ground and nowhere left to run. That makes me dangerous." The bounty hunters conferred among themselves, clearly debating their next move. They had expected either surrender or a running fight, not a prepared defensive position. Martha could see them reassessing the situation, weighing risk against reward. The first mistake came when they tried to flank the cabin by splitting up. 2 men began working their way around the left side of the clearing, while the third provided covering fire from the main trail. But Silas had anticipated this tactic, had shown Martha the natural choke points where the terrain would funnel attackers into predictable positions. "Now," Silas whispered. Martha struck the metal triangle they had positioned as a signal device. The clear note rang across the mountainside, and suddenly the forest came alive with noise. Rocks tumbled down steep slopes. Branches crashed through the underbrush, and echoes bounced off canyon walls from multiple directions. The bounty hunters froze, suddenly uncertain whether they faced one man or several. Silas had used his knowledge of mountain acoustics to create the illusion of multiple defenders, confusing their tactical assessment. In that moment of hesitation, Martha made her move. While the men's attention was focused upslope toward the phantom sounds, she crept down, through the trees to their tethered horses. Her heart pounded with terror, but her hands remained steady as she cut the animals loose and sent them scattering down the trail. The bounty hunters shouted in alarm as their escape route disappeared, but their confusion was only beginning. Silas had prepared the clearing with deadfalls and hidden obstacles that turned their advance into a treacherous navigation challenge. What should have been a simple uphill assault became a deadly puzzle. "This is your last chance, McGraw," the lead bounty hunter yelled, though his voice carried less confidence than before. "Surrender now, or we'll burn you out." The threat to use fire in the dry mountain forest revealed the men's desperation and inexperience with wilderness tactics. Martha saw Silas's expression harden at the reckless proposal. "You torch these woods, you'll kill yourselves along with us," Silas called back. "Wind's picking up, and there's only one way down this mountain. As if to emphasize his point, a gust of evening wind swept through the clearing, sending dry leaves swirling and reminding everyone present of how quickly fire could spread in such conditions. The standoff stretched into the gathering darkness, neither side willing to make the decisive move that would determine the outcome. Martha found herself thinking about the quilt in her pack, the symbol of two incomplete lives finding wholeness together. Whether they survived the night or not, she had discovered something precious in these mountains, the courage to fight for love. "Martha," Silas whispered during a lull in the shouting, "if things go bad, there's a trail behind the cabin that leads to Bear Creek. Follow it downstream until you reach the valley road. We stay together," Martha replied firmly. "Whatever happens." Silas looked at her with a mixture of love and despair. "These men won't hesitate to kill you if they think it'll flush me out." "Then we'd better make sure they don't get the chance," Martha said, adjusting her grip on the kitchen knife. The weapon felt strange in her hands, but no stranger than anything else about this extraordinary day. She was no longer the timid shopkeeper who had accepted others' limitations on her life. She was a woman in love, fighting for her future, and that made her more dangerous than any bounty hunter could imagine. The attack came with the full darkness, when the bounty hunters finally realized that waiting would only give their quarry more time to prepare. Martha heard them moving through the underbrush, their progress marked by the snap of twigs and the scrape of boots on stone. Silas had taught her to listen for such sounds, to read the mountain's voice and understand what it was telling her. Now that knowledge became crucial as shapes moved through the shadows below their position. The first shot shattered the mountain silence, muzzle flash lighting up the trees like brief lightning. Martha felt the bullet whine past her hiding place, close enough to part her hair. She pressed herself against the rocky outcrop that sheltered her, her kitchen knife clutched so tightly her knuckles went white. "Give it up, McGraw," called the lead bounty hunter. "We can do this all night, and you'll run out of ammunition long before we do." Silas's response came not in words, but in action. His rifle cracked from a position 30 yards from where he'd been moments before, and one of the bounty hunters cried out in pain. Martha couldn't tell how badly the man was hurt, but his curses echoed across the clearing with genuine distress. The mountain man's mobility was confusing his attackers, who had expected to face a stationary target. Instead, Silas moved through the terrain like a ghost, using his intimate knowledge of every rock and tree to stay one step ahead of their attempts to pin him down. But Martha could see the flaw in their defense. While Silas drew attention with his rifle fire, the third bounty hunter was working his way around the far side of the clearing, approaching the cabin from an angle that would put him behind their defensive positions. She had to act, and quickly. The kitchen knife felt inadequate against armed professionals, but Martha remembered Silas's words about courage coming in many forms. Sometimes the unexpected could be more effective than superior firepower. Moving as quietly as she could manage, Martha crept through the shadows toward the flanking bounty hunter's position. Her heart hammered against her ribs, but her breathing remained controlled. She had spent years hauling heavy loads and climbing stairs. Her body was stronger than most people realized. The bounty hunter was focused entirely on reaching the cabin. Undetected, his attention fixed on the rifle fire exchanged between his partners and Silas. He never saw Martha emerge from the tree line behind him. The kitchen knife went into his shoulder rather than the killing blow she had intended. But the surprise was complete. The man spun around with a shout of pain and confusion, his pistol swinging toward Martha's position. She didn't hesitate. Years of chopping vegetables and carving meat had given her hands strength and precision. The second strike found its mark in his gun arm, sending the weapon spinning into the darkness. "Silas!" she called out, her voice carrying clearly across the clearing. "One down on the north side." The wounded bounty hunter staggered away into the forest, clutching his injuries and cursing. Martha had never hurt another human being in her life, but she felt no remorse. Only grim satisfaction that the odds were now more even. The remaining two bounty hunters realized their tactical advantage was slipping away. Martha could hear them, calling to each other, trying to coordinate a final assault before their situation deteriorated further. That's when she remembered the signal fire Silas had prepared on the ridge above the cabin. Originally intended as a distress beacon, it could serve another purpose entirely. She began climbing toward the prepared pile of dry wood and oil-soaked rags. The ascent was treacherous in the darkness, but Martha's determination drove her upward. When she reached the signal fire, she struck a match with trembling fingers and touched it to the prepared tinder. The flame caught immediately, roaring to life in a pillar of orange light that could be seen for miles across the mountain valleys. Martha had no idea if anyone would respond to the signal, but it was their only hope of attracting help. Below in the clearing, the sudden illumination changed everything. The bounty hunters were exposed in the firelight, while Silas remained concealed in the shadows. His rifle spoke twice in quick succession, and Martha heard answering cries of pain and alarm. But the real miracle came 20 minutes later, when the sound of approaching horses echoed up from the valley trail. Martha watched through the flames. As torches appeared in the darkness, riders from Timber Ridge responding to the emergency signal. To her amazement, she recognized Sarah Morrison's voice calling out among the rescuers. The young woman who worked at the town's telegraph office had apparently been more observant than anyone realized. "We heard shooting," Sarah called up toward the cabin. "Martha, are you all right?" "We're here," Martha replied, her voice hoarse. "From smoke and exhaustion, the bounty hunters attacked us." What followed was a confused confrontation in the firelight as the townspeople faced off against the professional manhunters. But Sarah Morrison had brought something more valuable than numbers. She had brought proof. "I've been researching Silas McGraw all day," Sarah announced, holding up a telegram. "My brother Tom knew him during the war. Says Colonel Harrison was court-martialed posthumously 6 months after Chancellorsville for selling intelligence to the Confederates. The Army's been looking for McGraw to clear his name, not arrest him." The revelation hit the gathering like a thunderbolt. The bounty hunters' authority evaporated in the face of documented proof that their quarry was innocent. The wanted poster that had started. Everything was 8 years out of date, issued before the truth about Colonel Harrison's treachery had emerged. Martha climbed down from the ridge to find Silas standing in the firelight, his rifle lowered at last. The expression on his face was one of stunned disbelief, as if he couldn't quite grasp that his long exile might finally be over. "It's finished," Martha said, taking his hand as the signal fire burned bright above them. "You can stop running." The man who had saved his unit through an act of desperate courage finally allowed himself to believe in redemption. And the woman, who had found the strength to fight for love, discovered that sometimes the mountains themselves would echo with the sound of victory. 6 months later, Martha stood in the same mountain clearing where she had once fought for her life, but now it was decorated with wildflowers and filled with the voices of friends. The signal fire had been replaced by an altar crafted from pine logs, and the cabin that had served as a fortress now wore garlands of aspen leaves for a wedding celebration. Sarah Morrison had become an unexpected ally and friend. Her research skills having proved invaluable in clearing Silas's name completely. The Army had not only dropped all charges, but had issued a formal commendation for his actions in preventing Colonel Harrison's final betrayal. The medal he had carried with such guilt now rested in an honored place on their mantelpiece, its meaning transformed from burden to badge of courage. "You look beautiful," Sarah said as she helped Martha arrange the wildflowers in her hair. The wedding dress was Martha's own creation, sewn from the finest fabric the general store could provide, but cut to flatter rather than hide her substantial frame. Martha touched the silver locket at her throat, now paired with a simple gold band on a chain, Silas's promise ring, carved by his own hands from a piece of mountain maple. "I never imagined I could feel this happy," she admitted. The transformation in Timber Ridge's attitude had been gradual but genuine. Once the truth about Silas's war service became known, the community had embraced him as a hero rather than an outcast. His knowledge of mountain survival had proved invaluable during a harsh winter, and his quiet strength had earned respect from even his former critics. Mr. Henley had offered Martha her job back, but she had politely declined. Her new life required different skills: hunting, preserving food, managing a household in the wilderness. She had discovered capabilities she never knew she possessed, strengths that went far beyond the physical labor that had once defined her. A worth. "The minister's ready," Tom Morrison called from the makeshift altar. The young rancher had become one of Silas's closest friends, their shared memories of the war creating a bond that helped heal old wounds. Martha walked down the aisle, formed by their gathered friends, her worn leather boots replaced by new ones that Silas had crafted to fit her feet perfectly. Each step carried her toward the man who had seen her worth when she couldn't see it herself, who had taught her that love required courage, but rewarded it with transformation. Silas waited at the altar in his best clothes, his dark hair neatly trimmed and his beard shaped, but his eyes held the same gentle strength that had first moved her to trust him. In his hands he held the completed quilt, Martha's mother's pattern finished with her own careful stitches, now large enough to cover their marriage bed. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, but Martha barely heard the familiar words. Her attention was focused on Silas's face, on the wonder in his expression, as if he still couldn't quite believe this moment was real. The vows they exchanged were traditional in form, but profound in meaning. When Silas promised to honor and cherish her, Martha heard the echo of all the small kindnesses he had shown: the leg massage that started everything, the wildflowers gathered from high meadows, the patient teaching that had made her a partner in mountain life. When Martha promised to love and support him, she meant through nightmares and memories, through the healing process that would take years but was already well begun. She had learned to read the signs when past trauma threatened to overwhelm. Him had developed the patience to wait through dark moments and the wisdom to know when to offer comfort and when to simply be present. The ring exchange used bands that Silas had carved from gold. He had panned himself from mountain streams. They were simple and slightly irregular, bearing none of the polish of store-bought jewelry, but they represented hours of patient work and deep consideration. "By the power vested in me, I now pronounce you husband and wife," the minister announced. "Silas, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle and sweet, full of promise, and unmarked by the desperation that had characterized their early encounters. Martha felt complete in a way she had never imagined possible, not because marriage had somehow fixed her perceived flaws, but because she had found someone who celebrated her strength and complimented her spirit. The celebration that followed was simple but joyous. Mrs. Henderson, transformed from critic to tentative supporter, had organized a feast using Martha's own recipes. The woman who had once warned her about reaching too high now praised her courage in following her heart. As evening approached and the guests began to depart, Martha and Silas found themselves alone in the clearing where their relationship had been forged through crisis. The mountains around them glowed with alpenglow, painting the peaks in shades of gold and rose. "No regrets?" Silas asked, his arm around her waist as they watched the sunset. "Only that it took us so long to find each other," Martha replied honestly. They had built a life together that defied every expectation Timber Ridge society had held about both of them. The unmarriageable woman had found not just a husband, but a true partner. The dangerous mountain man had discovered that healing came through connection rather than isolation. Their cabin had become a refuge for others as well, travelers seeking shelter, townspeople needing help with wilderness skills, young couples wanting advice about building relationships on mutual respect rather than social convention. "What do you think people will remember about our story?" Martha asked, as stars began to appear in the darkening sky. Silas considered the question thoughtfully. "That love is braver than fear," he said finally. "That people can change when they're Seen truly that the mountains hold room for all kinds of courage? Martha nodded, thinking of the artifacts of their courtship now treasured in their home. The carved robin that had given her hope, the quilt that symbolized completion, the knife that had defended their future, the rings that bound them together. Tomorrow would bring new challenges as they continued building their life together, but tonight was for celebration and gratitude. They had fought for their love and won not just each other, but the right to define themselves beyond society's narrow expectations. As they walked hand in hand toward their cabin, Martha marveled at the journey that had brought her from resigned acceptance to fierce joy. The mountain man and the woman society had dismissed had proven that compassion and courage could indeed create beauty that shocked more profoundly than appearances ever could.